During a storm, Greg arrives at the hospital with his pregnant wife, who has just been struck by lightning. After being told that Anna didn't make it, the man asks if his son survived, then discovers that the baby was born prematurely and with a genetic condition called albinism. When he arrives at the maternity ward and sees that child with a pale body without any pigmentation, Greg starts to cry and refuses to believe that that baby is his son. As his father refused to raise him, the young man grew up on a farm under the care of his grandfather and, years later, the old man passed away. When the police arrive to investigate the cause of perishment, they discover that there is a teenager hiding in the house, so Doug enlists the help of Jesse, the director of the town's orphanage, to help him rescue Jeremy. The detective believes that the young man was kept locked up in the basement so that people couldn't see him, as he looks different from the others. When he meets the police, Jeremy tells them that his grandfather was making coffee when he suddenly fell and lost his life. When asked about his real name, the young man reveals that his name is Jeremy Reed, but his grandparents called him Powder. During the conversation with Jesse, he says that he prefers to live in the basement to hide from the sunlight, as the brightness bothers his eyes. Despite never having attended school, the young man has read hundreds of books and memorized every page of each one. At that moment, Jesse realizes that this young man is special and decides to take him to the orphanage, because now Jeremy has no other family to stay with. As soon as he arrives at his new home, the young man becomes the laughing stock of the other residents, who are completely intrigued by his appearance. During lunchtime, when the young man is eating alone in the cafeteria, Johnny and his gang approach him to try to force him to take part in an initiation ritual and order him to spend the day with a spoon stuck up his nose. But instead of following the veteran's orders, Jeremy picks up the spoon and starts rubbing his thumb. At that moment, the spoon stands on its own and becomes a magnet that attracts all the metal objects around it. Seeing that tower of cutlery forming before their eyes, all the other orphans are perplexed and realize that Jeremy is even stranger than they could have imagined. That afternoon, Jesse takes the young man to a doctor's appointment and Dr. Dwayne says that, despite not having a hair on his body, Jeremy is a very healthy young man. In a few days' time, Jeremy's contact lenses will arrive, so he'll be able to walk in the sun without his glasses and his eyes will look like anyone else's. As the young man is much more intellectually advanced than the other high school students, Jesse decides to send him to a school for gifted youngsters. During science class, the teacher turns on a high voltage source to show how electricity moves and, on seeing those bright rays, Jeremy is startled. Suddenly, he starts shaking. At that moment, Lindsay realizes that something is wrong with her new classmate and tries to help him calm down, but Jeremy ends up attracting the electric current and his body is electrocuted. While the young man is unconscious, his body begins to float and his worried teacher decides to destroy the high voltage source in order to save him. Seeing his student passed out, Donald tries to wake him up and, when he touches the young man, all the hairs on his body stand on end from the static electricity. That afternoon, Jeremy is taken to hospital and, after examining him, Dwayne says that he hasn't suffered any injuries. Despite the account of the teacher and all the other students who were present in the classroom at the time of the incident, the doctor does not believe that his patient had suffered an electric shock, as there are no symptoms on his body to indicate that anything of the kind had happened. Upon hearing this, Donald is even more intrigued and curious to know what happened, because, according to science, it is completely impossible for a human body to attract electricity like that. What's more, he claims it's a miracle that anyone survived the phenomenon, so the professor is confused and plans to talk to Jeremy to understand what happened. While Doug talks to the teacher and the sheriff about the young man's condition, Jeremy escapes from the room and leaves the hospital without being seen. He then walks back to his old house and, on the way, ends up passing the neighborhood where Lindsay lives. When he sees him, Zach runs towards him and starts barking furiously, but Jeremy isn't afraid of the dog and approaches the fence to pet him. When she discovers that her classmate is well, Lindsay feels relieved and, while talking to the young man, she realizes that all her neighbors are looking at him. At this point, Jeremy confesses to being able to hear people's thoughts and feelings, as well as having access to their memories. However, on hearing this, Lindsay asks if her colleague is all right, as she believes he is delirious. At this point, Jeremy realizes that he has said too much and continues on his way to the farm where he grew up. However, while crossing the train tracks, the young man is found by the town sheriff, who convinces him to return to the hospital. When he gets into the car, Jeremy reveals that the worst day of his life was in hospital, when he was abandoned by his father shortly after birth. The next day, Jesse takes the young man to take a test to assess his IQ and then he goes to meet the school teachers to find out the result. When he sees him, Aaron asks a few questions, because he didn't believe Jesse when she said that all that young man's knowledge of the world came from books, since he never left the farm where he lived to have contact with the outside world. In addition, the young man has never been able to watch TV, as the electronic devices don't work in his presence. According to Donald, Jeremy's test result indicates that he is a genius, but Aaron corrects him by saying that there is no classification for that young man, as his score was so high that he went off the scale. All the tests indicate that Jeremy has the most advanced intellect in human history. At that moment, Jesse says that those people are there to help him and the young man asks them to send him back home. Then the woman reveals that the farm is up for sale and a large part of it belongs to the bank, as the mortgage is in arrears. On hearing this, Jeremy gets upset and the lights in the room start to flicker. Looking at their watches, all the teachers realize that the device has stopped working normally and the flickering continues until all the electricity is cut off. Furious, he leaves the room and takes the school bus back to the orphanage. That weekend, the kids from the shelter get together to go camping and, as usual, Jeremy isolates himself from the others because he feels he can't get along with them. Seeing the young man sitting alone on a log, the sheriff approaches him to talk to him and soon realizes that the young man is not comfortable there. It's a muggy night and it looks like it's going to rain later, so Jeremy confesses that whenever a storm brews, he can feel it, as if he's part of it. The young man feels like a lightning rod, because every time he sees an electric current coming down from the sky, he has the impression that it is heading in his direction. According to him, his grandmother used to say that lightning was a manifestation of God and he wonders why God took his mother the night he was born. When asked how he knows that his mother lost her life after being struck by lightning, Jeremy reveals that he remembers everything that happened before he was even born. The next morning, the young man wakes up very early to walk through the forest and explore nature for the first time. At the sight of a multitude of dry leaves scattered on the ground, Jeremy bends down and touches the ground. At that moment, the lizards around him walk over to him and one of them climbs onto his hand. However, when Johnny and Mitch approach, the animals go away and Jeremy soon realizes that the bullies are nearby. The men were hunting in the forest, but when he saw the defenseless young man, Johnny pointed his rifle at him and threatened to shoot him. At that moment, Mitch tries to convince his friend to put the gun down, but the man doesn't listen and is about to pull the trigger when he is interrupted by the sound of a gunshot. He immediately runs to meet his other friends and Jeremy goes after them. As he approaches the lake, the young man discovers that Deputy Harley has just shot a deer and the animal is about to lose its life. Looking into the deer's eyes, Jeremy can feel its pain and places his hand on the animal. At that moment, Harley tries to pull him away, but the young man holds his fist and transfers the deer's pain to the deputy, who starts writhing on the ground. Hearing the man's screams, Johnny finds the perfect excuse to complete his goal of eliminating Jeremy, but Mitch lifts the barrel of the gun at the moment of the shot and manages to save him. Startled by the noise, the young man ends up letting go of Harley. The man then immediately walks away and is supported by the group of bullies while Jeremy mourns the loss of the deer. Upon returning to the orphanage, the newcomer is taken to the principal's office and the sheriff asks why Harley was taken to hospital by ambulance with a suspected heart attack. The young man then reveals that the deputy didn't know what harm he was doing to the animal, so he just helped him to see. However, on hearing this explanation, Doug doesn't believe what the young man is saying and leaves the room so that Jesse can talk to him alone. At that moment, Jeremy says that he can't stand living in that place any longer, because the people there only know how to do and think horrible things. Thanks to his high capacity for empathy, the young man has the ability to know what people are feeling and claims that Jesse is only pretending to be his friend, because a real friend doesn't hold another person against their will. As Jeremy expresses his anger, all the glass in the room shatters in an explosion and the light bulbs burst. When he gets home, Doug finds Dr. Dwayne making a routine visit to his bedridden wife and says that there is no explanation for the fact that Emma is still alive, as she has been unconscious for several months. The doctor suggests that the sheriff admit his wife to the hospital to facilitate medical care, but Doug says that if Emma were conscious, she would prefer to spend her last moments at home. That night, while he's alone in the orphanage cafeteria being stunned by his own thoughts, Jeremy receives a visit from his teacher and he says that he's different since he touched him. Since that day, Donald says he's full of energy, like he's 18 again, and his ability to concentrate is also much better. After saying this, Donald asks if his student has ever read anything about Albert Einstein and says that the physicist believed in life after perishment, since he defended the idea that energy never ceases to exist, it just changes. He also said that if human beings were to use 100% of their brains, their species would become pure energy and wouldn't even need a physical body. So Donald believes it's possible that the accident Jeremy's mother suffered before giving birth brought him closer to this level of energy that no one has ever reached before. After formulating this theory, the professor understands why Jeremy wanted to return to the basement where he lived, because until then he had never come into contact with human evil. All the young man knew about the outside world was the information contained in his books, but he had yet to experience the different facets of humanity. When he realizes this, Donald begins to fear for the young man's future, as he has yet to see anything that human beings are capable of. The scientist believes that humanity will take thousands of years to reach the level of evolution of Jeremy's mind and says that he will help him adapt to that world. At that moment, Donald shakes the young man's hand and his hair stands on end once again. This is one of the few times that Jeremy feels the touch of another human being, because people were afraid to touch him, even his grandparents. When he realizes how much the young man needs him, Donald touches his face and Jeremy is moved, so he lies down to have his head caressed for the first time. A few days later, Doug goes to visit the deputy and discovers that he has gotten rid of all his weapons. Surprised by this news, the sheriff asks what prompted this decision and Harley confesses that he went out to hide and hunt with the young men at the lake. That day, when he saw the deer shot near the lake, Jeremy put his hand on the still living animal and touched the deputy at the same time. Suddenly, Harley's heart raced and his body began to shake, as he felt hurt and frightened. All the terror the man had inflicted on the animal was shown to him openly and he could feel the pain of losing his life. According to the deputy, this was the worst thing he had ever felt in his life, because it was as if he was perishing himself. After this experience, the man doesn't feel capable of taking an innocent life again. After hearing this story, Doug decides to pay Jeremy a visit and, after asking Jesse's permission, the sheriff takes the young man to his house in the hope that he will help his wife. Upon entering the room, the young man approaches Emma's body and touches her head. By doing so, he is able to gain access to the woman's thoughts and desires, so he claims that what is keeping her trapped in that body is the fear of leaving her husband alone. The young man says that Emma can't leave until she's sure that Doug and Steven will be all right. The sheriff hasn't spoken to his son for several years and the only people who know about it are the family's closest friends and relatives. When he hears Jeremy recount in detail a story from when Steven was a child, Doug is sure that the young man is in contact with his wife. At that moment, Emma opens her eyes and the sheriff has the chance to say goodbye to his wife for a few seconds before she leaves for good. Upon receiving the news about the loss of his mother, Steven immediately drives there and hugs his father for the first time in several years. That weekend, Lindsay invites Jeremy to the park and takes the opportunity to ask him what people are like on the inside. The young man then says that most humans feel separated from nature, but they're not, because they're part of everything and everyone. Upon hearing this, Lindsay says that she can't understand this statement and Jeremy reveals that this is because there is a limit that the human body can't overcome. Because of this, people fail to realize that all living beings on the planet are connected. To prove that he is telling the truth, the young man holds the young woman's hand and, at that moment, they are both able to access each other's deepest feelings and thoughts. At this point, Lindsay discovers that Jeremy was abandoned by his father on the day he was born and, since then, he has felt very alone. Contrary to what everyone thinks, Lindsay thinks Jeremy is the most beautiful person she has ever seen and decides to kiss him. Just then, the young woman's father appears to interrupt them and starts shouting at the young man. Seeing Jeremy in trouble, Jesse rushes over to help him and orders Dick to let him go immediately. Before leaving, the man orders the principal to keep that freak away from his daughter, otherwise he will sue the orphanage and bankrupt it. Later, when he gets home, Jeremy starts packing his bags to leave, because he can no longer deal with the hatred of the people in that town. Before leaving, the young man enters the basketball court and, once again, Johnny approaches him to tease him. After stealing his hat, the man challenges Jeremy to take it back and, by touching the bully, he manages to access one of Johnny's most traumatic memories. When he was a child, the young man suffered attacks from his stepfather and this turned him into an aggressive and bitter person. Hearing Jeremy describe one of his memories in detail, Johnny attacks him and drags him off the court. After removing his clothes, they push him into a mud puddle and, when the young man gets up, the metal accessories the delinquents are wearing start to be drawn towards him. Suddenly, lightning strikes in the puddle and everyone gets scared, including Jeremy, who ends up falling into the mud again. Soon afterwards, the young man gets up, but Johnny remains unconscious and his friends realize that his heart has stopped beating. After putting on his clothes, Jeremy walks over to the young man and starts giving him a heart massage, using the electricity in his body as a defibrillator. Thanks to the new guy, Johnny wakes up and, as a thank you, Mitch helps him get a ride back to the farm. When he arrives at his old house, the first thing Jeremy does is go to the basement, where he used to spend most of his time. Hours later, Jesse arrives at the property and, upon entering the basement, discovers that all the books in the young man's library have been taken. Realizing that Jeremy is distraught, the woman approaches him and says that from the first moment she saw him, She knew that the young man was special and that the world was not ready to receive someone as incredible as him. However, Jessie promises that if Jeremy trusts her, she will help him find a place where he can be happy and loved. At that moment, the young man hugs her and Donald appears to accompany them to the car. However, when they leave the house, the trio run into Doug and Harley, who are there to uphold the law and take the special young man back to the orphanage. As soon as he gets out of the car, the sheriff sees the look of despair on Jeremy's face and realizes that he has already suffered far more than he deserves. When he questions Donald about what he and Jessie intend to do, Doug realizes that the pair are not planning to take the young man back to the orphanage, but want to give him a new life. Determined to help them, the sheriff asks Harley to come home, but the deputy refuses to allow those people to break the law. He immediately contacts headquarters to inform them of the escape, but Doug takes the walkie-talkie from his hand and, with Donald's help, destroys it. After saying goodbye to his friends, Jeremy runs across the lawn and is followed by the deputy, but the man can't catch up with him. Suddenly, a storm approaches and the young man is struck by lightning, but he keeps running. At that moment, all the energy contained within him is released and returns to nature, causing the young man's physical body to be destroyed in an explosion. After being hit by that wave of energy, the quartet realizes that Jeremy has disappeared and Doug comes to the conclusion that, like his wife, the young man has left that planet to go to a much better place. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.